10-year-old cold cases that were solved by cigarettes. Welcome to Creepshow, where the shadows of the past reveal their darkest secrets. Imagine a world where a single discarded cigarette butt holds the key to unlocking mysteries that have haunted families for decades. Today, we dive into 10 cold cases that remained unsolved, until cigarettes led detectives straight to the truth. From tragic losses to unexpected justice, join us as we unravel how these tiny traces brought closure to some of the most perplexing crimes. Are you ready to uncover the chilling stories that cigarettes helped solve? Let's begin. Number 10. Patricia Barnes. In August of 1995, the body of Patricia Barnes, a homeless woman who was 61 years old, was discovered in a ditch in Seattle, Washington. Her body was found naked, and she had 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Her killer had discarded her there. At the time, there were over 100 pieces of evidence collected from the scene, and there was also a witness who provided sketch artists with information about a suspect. However, there were no leads in the case. As of 2018, the investigation into Barnes's murder was revived, and the evidence was distributed to crime labs in the states of Washington, Texas, and Florida that specialize in forensic genealogy with the goal of identifying a relative of the perpetrator. One of the laboratories was successful in locating a cousin of the suspect in the year 2021, and they later presented the authorities with the name of the cousin, Douglas Keith Crone. In addition to having a criminal background that included robbery and kidnapping, Crone was a resident of the Seattle region at the time that Barnes was murdered. On the other hand, Crone passed away in 2016 as a result of an accidental electrocution. Once the authorities had a name, they were able to cross-reference the DNA from their evidence, notably the cigarette butts, and match it to a blood sample that was collected during Crone's autopsy. This indicated that he was the one who killed Barnes. After nearly 3 decades, Barnes's family was finally able to find peace of mind, knowing that her murderer had been identified. Number 9. Paul Aikman. Paul Aikman, who was 35 years old at the time, was stabbed to death at a rest stop in Oklahoma in the year 1985. A number of pieces of evidence, including fingerprints and cigarette butts, were gathered for the investigation. Nevertheless, the authorities were unable to identify any potential culprits. In the year 2019, the investigators were given a break in the investigation when they discovered that the DNA from the cigarette butts was linked to Earl Wayne Wilson through an unplanned check of the National DNA Database known as CODIS. Wilson was already serving time in an Oklahoma jail at the time for the sexual assault he committed against a lady who was 20 years old. Despite the fact that Wilson first denied any involvement in the incident, he eventually entered a guilty plea to the murder of Aikman in 2021 as part of an arrangement for a lower penalty. As a result, he was sentenced to 20 years in jail. Number 8. Tonya McKinley. Tonya McKinley, who was 23 years old at the time, had gone to Daryl's Bar and Grill in Pensacola, Florida, to celebrate the impending new year of 1985. However, she never came back to her son, who was only 18 months old at the time. On January 1, 1985, her body was discovered. She had been sexually assaulted and then strangled to death. Her body was found half submerged. The police conducted interviews with everyone who had been to the restaurant, as well as with McKinley's friends and relatives, but they were unable to identify any suspects. Nevertheless, as a result of technological advancements and the proliferation of Internet laboratories that analyze DNA for individuals who are searching for long-lost family relatives, the authorities were able to extract DNA from bodily fluids that were left behind and construct a family tree that would ultimately lead them to Daniel Wells, the person who was responsible for the murder of McKinley. By the time the police had a name, they were able to track down Wells, and when he made the mistake of throwing a cigarette butt out the window, it was all the evidence they required to match the DNA and arrest him for the murder of McKinley. On the 18th of March in the year 2020, Wells was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder as well as sexual battery. On the other hand, Wells committed suicide by hanging himself inside his cell before McKinley's family could receive any kind of official justice. Number 7. Roxanne Woods. On the evening of February 20th, 1987, Roxanne Woods and her husband Terry had spent the evening bowling together, but they had driven home separately. Roxanne was the first person to arrive at their residence, but Terry was the one who discovered his wife lifeless in their kitchen, with her throat sliced. The police had a suspicion that a man named Patrick Gilham was involved, but they never had any proof that might show that he was actually involved. The investigation into Woods was reopened by the police in 2001, but they were never able to make any headway in the investigation. It wasn't until 2021 that they finally got the breakthrough they had been hoping for in the case. Credible tip was received by the investigators, which indicated that they should indeed investigate Gilham as a potential suspect. In spite of the fact that he had been convicted of rape in 1979 and that he had lived in the region, the CODIS database did not contain any of his DNA. After that, the police brought in MSP Forensic Laboratories to take up the duty of examining the evidence that had been obtained previously. However, a significant portion of the DNA had been damaged due to the fact that it was so old. On the other hand, investigators were able to connect the DNA that was gathered on the night of Wood's murder to a cigarette butt that Gilham dropped while he was under observation. This was accomplished by combining their sample with the process of rebuilding a family tree through genealogy. On February 17, 2022, Gilham was taken into custody, and he was ultimately sentenced to a total of 23 years in prison. Number 6. Michael Lee. Michael Lee, a native of Indiana, who was 29 years old and worked as an ironworker, was discovered shot in the head on October 21, 1980, when he was in Arizona. Despite the fact that cigarette butts and other objects were gathered as evidence, the police were never able to make any headway in determining who was responsible for Lee's death. Nevertheless, in June of 2018, the Yavapai Sheriff's Office resumed the investigation and sent the cigarette butts out for testing in the hopes of creating a strong lead in the investigation. David Ellsworth Widmer was determined to be the individual based on the DNA findings that were obtained. They were also able to learn that Widmer, together with an accomplice named Rocky Crabtree, both of whom had lengthy criminal history, had the goal of stealing Lee. This was discovered after the DNA results had been proven, and the police continued their investigation. Nevertheless, considering that they were unable to find Lee's money, they decided to shoot him instead. Lee's family was relieved to finally have answers, despite the fact that both Widmer and Crabtree had passed away prior to the discovery of this evidence. Number 5. Marilyn Hickey. A taxi driver brought Marilyn Hickey and an unidentified man to her apartment in Bremerton, Washington, on the evening of September 9, 1992. The man was not identified. The last time anyone would ever see her was at this very moment. Later, she was discovered in her residence, having been strangled. A piece of paper with the name Lee Miller written on it was found by the police in Hickey's handbag. However, they were never able to find him. On the other hand, in 2006, law enforcement investigators in Boise, Idaho, were working on a separate cold case when they discovered that the DNA evidence they collected was identical to that of Hickey's murderer. In addition, the Boise Police Department was also given the name Lee Miller, and it was at this time that they started watching Lee, and also began cross-referencing evidence. By obtaining a cigarette butt that he had left outside of his apartment, they were able to demonstrate that he was, in fact, the murderer in both instances. After pleading guilty to the murder of Hickey, Lee was given a sentence of 17 years in prison for the crime of second-degree murder. Furthermore, he entered a guilty plea to the murder of Cheryl Barrett, who was 49 years old, and was sentenced to an extra 25 years in jail for his involvement in the crime. Number 4. Jerri Ann Jones. While Jerri Ann Jones was waiting for a ride outside the Harris Teeter supermarket in Charlotte, North Carolina, where she worked, she was kidnapped in July of 1987. At the time, she was only 19 years old. There was no fresh evidence that came to light, despite the fact that Harris Teeter President Robert Goodale offered a reward of $10,000 in the hopes of encouraging anyone who had information or someone who knew the killer to come forward. Charlotte Cold Case Squad was founded in 2003 with the intention of utilizing recent developments in technology and forensics in order to solve cases that had been open for a long time. Following the entry of cigarette butts and semen specimens from Jones's case into the CODIS database, the DNA was able to be matched to that of Terry Alvin Hyatt through a connection. The fortunate thing was that they were aware of his precise whereabouts. Hyatt was already on death row at the time for the murder of 2 other ladies. On August 2, 2005, Hyatt entered a guilty plea to the charge of killing Jones, and he was subsequently sentenced to life in prison. Number 3. Anita Piteau. In the 1960s, Anita Piteau uprooted her life and moved away from her home in Maine in the hopes of achieving great success in the entertainment industry. In spite of this, her body was discovered on March 14, 1968, with a cut neck, having been beaten and having been raped. The fact that both Piteau and her murderer would remain undetected for the subsequent 52 years was one of the things that made the case of Piteau even more troubling. In an effort to identify the Jane Doe, the police disseminated drawings of the individual and gathered items like clothing, jewelry, and cigarette butts from the scene. They did this in the hope that someone would recognize her. Despite this, neither the sketches nor the evidence had any effect on the investigation. Then, in 2019, the police finally identified the murderer, Johnny Crisco, who had passed away from cancer in 2015. They did this by utilizing the DNA from the cigarette butt that was discovered in conjunction with research on his family tree. In the year 2020, the law enforcement agency sought the assistance of Colleen Fitzpatrick, a certified forensic genealogist. Using Piteau's DNA, she was able to trace it back to a relative who was still residing in Maine at the time. Jane Doe was ultimately recognized after a long and arduous 52 years, and her remains were returned to her family in Maine. Number 2. Angie Dodge. Angie Dodge, then 18 years old, had moved into her first apartment in Idaho Falls in late 1996. However, she was later discovered to have been assaulted, raped, and had her throat sliced so severely that it came dangerously close to causing her to be decapitated. Christopher Tapp admitted to killing Dodge in 1997. However, his confession was only provided after he was forced by the police, who hinted that he would face the death penalty if he did not confess to the crime. Tapp was sentenced to 20 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit, despite the fact that his DNA did not match the DNA that was obtained from the scene. And he later recanted his confession about the events surrounding the incident. In spite of the fact that Dodge was found guilty, the case was still classified a cold case because the person who committed the murder had never been located. For the following 20 years, Dodge's mother, Carol, did not let up on her efforts to find the person responsible for her daughter's death and to clear Tapp of any wrongdoing. In 2017, Tapp was finally made available to the public as a result of the combined efforts of Carol and the Innocence Project. In the year 2019, detectives started examining public genealogy databases and collaborated with genetic genealogist C.C. Moore at Parabon Laboratories. Moore was able to construct a family tree based on the DNA that was acquired. A suspect named Brian Drips, who lived directly across the street from Angie at the time of her murder, was able to be located as a result of this method. During the investigation, he was not only questioned initially, but also initially. The law enforcement officers started following Drips and collecting cigarette butts as he dropped them in a casual manner. When they gathered a number of samples, they sent them out to be tested, and the results showed that they were a verified match to the DNA that they discovered on Dodge. After being taken into custody, Drip admitted that he had been under the influence of narcotics at the time of the incident and that he had no intention of killing Dodge. On the 8th of June in 2021, he was given a sentence of life in jail. Number 1. Sarah Yarborough. A drill team competition was scheduled to take place in December 1991, and Sarah Yarborough, then 16 years old, was on her way to school to get ready for it. Later on the morning, her body was discovered close to the high school she attended in Washington. She had been assaulted and strangled to death. The sketches of the individual who is thought to be the murderer were made with the assistance of witnesses who were present in the vicinity. During the subsequent 20 years, the police conducted routine searches of DNA databases in the hope of establishing a connection. Nevertheless, the investigation appeared to be fruitless. On the other hand, in 2019, a suspect, Patrick Nicholas, was ultimately identified through the use of forensic genealogy research. Despite the fact that Nicholas was previously convicted of rape in 1983, he remained undiscovered by law enforcement due to the fact that his conviction occurred prior to the establishment of CODIS. Later on, in 1993, he was arrested for child molestation. However, the accusations against him were reduced to a misdemeanor, which meant that he was once again exempt from having to submit his DNA. When investigators became aware that Nicholas was a suspect, they immediately began conducting intensive surveillance. As a result, they were able to recover cigarette butts and a napkin that he had left outside of a local strip mall. All of those objects had DNA that was identical to the samples that were taken in 1991. An arrest warrant was issued for Nicholas in October of 2019, and he is still awaiting trial. These 10 cases illustrate how seemingly insignificant pieces of evidence, like discarded cigarette butts, can play a pivotal role in unraveling complex mysteries. From advancements in DNA technology to the relentless pursuit of truth by dedicated investigators, justice has been served in ways that once seemed impossible. Stay tuned as we continue to explore more chilling stories where the smallest clues led to the most profound revelations. And there you have it, 10 cold cases finally brought to light thanks to the unassuming cigarette butt. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the smallest clues can make the biggest breakthroughs. If these stories kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Creepshow for more tales of mystery, suspense, and true crime. Have a case you think deserves the spotlight? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your suggestions. Until next time, stay curious and keep seeking the truth in the shadows.